Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Anfi online interview series, Stories Worth Telling. Definitely, story that you will hear today is worth telling, and I'm really thrilled to have our special guest, Dr. Moshe Pearl, tonight with us. Moshe is world-class expert in neurofeedback and also in quantitative EEG and EEG analysis. And he has almost 2 decades of experience teaching and mentoring practitioners in Australia and also internationally. I remember one of our workshops, I think it was Moshe with Simon Fisher, when we were going around introducing ourselves and would say, my name is such and such, and I was trained by Moshe, and the next person said the same, I was trained by Moshe as well. And after a while, someone just said, yeah, I know, and you were trained by Moshe also. So that we realized that almost all of us who are practicing neurofeedback here were trained by you, Moshe. And that was a decade, more than a decade ago. Meanwhile, you treated more than 1,000 clients, and you also saw the impact of neurofeedback and how amazing tool that is in treating clients with various presentations. And you mentored more than 100 practitioners. In this field that is, it's really steep learning curve and it takes time to master and become really proficient in neurofeedback. And also you studied with many of recognized world experts in this field and also in the field of quantitative EEG. And what is one of your biggest skills, and one that I pointed out a long time ago, Moshe, is that you can distill the knowledge of others. And then you can transform that in a form that is understandable to us as students. Often I would take your notes. Now we will sit together and listen to the same presentation, and I will ask Moshe, can you give me your notes and just help me understand a little bit better concepts that were provided by Yuri Kropotov or Jay Gunkelman. And that's really, it's a rare skill to have, because there are many concepts that we learn about neurofeedback, and especially related to quantitative EEG and EEG, that are not easy for us to understand. So I would like to really thank you, sir, for all your work that you've done in this field for all of us that were taught by you. And I'm really excited to have you as a guest tonight and to hear your story.
Okay. And where do you want me to start?
So let's start from the beginning, Moshe. You know, when we were discussing what to talk about today, what really resonated with me is to hear about your life before neurofeedback. So I wouldn't like us to start with neurofeedback, we'll get there, but actually to tell us a little bit about your childhood. Where did you grow up? Tell us about your early experiences.
Okay. Yeah, whether it's relevant or not, I'll just launch into it. I'm Jewish, born into a family that was pretty much Holocaust survivors. And as a result, from the time I can remember, we were all thinking about that we're going to grow up and go to Israel. So we were very Zionist. And, you know, that was down the road, of course. When I was a kid, I didn't really care much about that. But in school, you know, I was good at school. I never really knew why. I was sort of, yeah, I did okay, did good. And I remember that it wasn't until I was in 8th grade that I actually studied for a test. I didn't even know that that's what one does. And of all things, it was in history, because I liked maths and science, and I didn't like English or history and any of that. But I studied and I did really well in it. So not that that changed the way I did anything, because I still didn't really study a whole lot. Was always a last minute person. It took pressure to get me to do anything, especially study. And I just get bored. I remember staring out the windows in high school, just in English class. Now, in maths and science classes, I didn't stare out the window because I was interested, so I paid attention. And, you know, to me, it was just sort of like, didn't want to do it and didn't really make an effort. And I could have done better, but I just didn't work at it. And of course, anybody that's studied and knows about ADHD goes, yeah, we know this. So when I finished high school, I went to Israel and I studied physics in Israel. And it's sort of interesting because the language that you study in is sort of the language you remember a lot of the stuff. And so I can remember mathematics in Hebrew. I don't know what the words are in English. So, you know, so if somebody talks about mathematics and at that level, yeah, I know it in Hebrew. And that would have been 1969. And the students that were in the class had all finished their military service. And they had to work to make a living and study at night or find night jobs. It was tough. There was no university campus life like we think about in Australia or in America. None of that. They just came there, they worked, they went to their job and they studied. And yeah, just a very different atmosphere. And when I actually studied this stuff, I actually did really well, but didn't always study. And I went to live, because I was a Zionist and a socialist, I went and lived in a kibbutz. And a kibbutz was, at that time, it was a small village, really. And a lot of the things that go on in a small village is what you see in a kibbutz, meaning everybody knows everybody else's business. There are no secrets about anything. So if somebody's had an affair with somebody, oh yeah, everybody knows about it. Okay, but one of the things that struck me about being on this kibbutz was that you didn't have to have money for anything. You didn't have to walk around with money in your pocket because you went to the dining room, you ate, you needed clothes, you went to the place to pick up the clothes. You know, it was like, that was quite amazing. And that's the way things were then. So I lived in a kibbutz, and then because I was living in Israel, I ended up having to go to the army and became a tankist, and actually was in the war in 1973 in Israel. And if anybody ever wants to think about the evils of war, just think about the absurdity, the absolute absurdity of people trying to kill each other. I mean, here's a person on the other side of my sights. I don't know who they are. I don't know where they came from. Under different circumstances, we'd be good friends. And for some strange reason, I'm trying to kill them and they're trying to kill me. And you think, and this is the sum total of human civilization, that all of what we've done and all of what we learned is so that we can kill each other? It just boggles my mind. And to this day, I carry little bits of Russian shrapnel around in my body. And do the people in Russia know? The person who went to a factory and made, you know, it's like, what has they got to do with me? Nothing. And there's no enmity. And yet this is what it is. And the saddest thing for me that I saw was that, you know, you're always taught that we will be victorious as a soldier. That's what they teach you. And so when you see that the enemy has been vanquished or injured or whatever, yeah, well, but in that war, we saw a lot of our own people injured and worse. And even all my friends in my unit, they were saying, oh, there's got to be a better way than this. And I was thinking, yeah, there needs to be a better way than this. In other words, you know, we need to figure out how to make peace. But those same people within about 2 years had reverted to saying, no, The only way is with an iron fist. And then I'm thinking, what hope is there? Not in this generation. And that was in what, 1975, 76. So even though I loved Israel, I had to leave. I couldn't bear the thought of having to continually be there to kill somebody. I couldn't do it. So I left Israel and came to America, the Golden Land. And I ended up studying psychology in Texas. I didn't think I really wanted to be a physicist. And that in itself was interesting because in America, they just said to me, yeah, we don't care that you didn't study undergraduate psychology. It doesn't matter to us. You got an undergraduate degree. It means you know how to study. So take a few undergraduate courses and start your master's. So that's a real positive about America is they get on with it. They can see. So I was in Texas, of all places. And interestingly, I ended up doing a lot of neuropsych courses. And that was mainly because the professor that taught neuropsych wasn't a maniac about having to do thousands of hours of work in their subject. And a lot of the other professors were like that. So he was a guy that you go in, it's reasonable, you do the work, you get your grade, you're finished. It was lovely. So I did a lot of neuropsych courses. And among the courses I took the Halstead-Raytan, and I don't know if anybody knows what that is anymore, but it was this really complicated test of brain function that was the acme, the very best that the West could offer, right? Regardless of the fact that Luria had already come out with his stuff and it had already been translated and it was years ahead. His stuff from the 1940s was ahead of what was going on in the West in the 60s. That's how far ahead of the game he was, right? So this Halstead-Raytan, you do all of these different tests and it takes hours. And at the end of it, you can decide whether the person has brain damage or not. And you can figure out which quadrant of the damage might be in. And of course, some guy comes into me dragging his right leg and can't move his right arm. You know, I don't need 3 hours of testing to figure out what's going on here. And then on top of that, he's aphasic. So you go, oh, you know, anyway. So a very interesting thing that happened with that was that at North Texas State University, where I was studying, there was a speech department. And so I'm a psychologist. What do I know how to treat this? So I took him to the speech pathology department. And one of the people there very unkindly said to me, what are you doing with this guy? And so you don't know how to work with him. You know, this is a very unkind statement, but yet very true, which made me understand that testing is not an end unto itself. If you do testing, you've got to be able to do something with it. And she, of course, could do speech therapy, which is what he needed. So that was just one of these little vignettes. Anyway, when I finished my studies, I was living in East Texas, and I did work at the local juvenile justice department because I did assessments for them, and also worked in schools. And at that time, that was when DSM-2 was fading out and DSM-3 was coming in. And I never knew this at the time, but in the United States, special ed is very broad. You only have to have a difference of 15 points between an IQ and an achievement test to qualify for special education services. And they call that resource room. So you get pulled out for your reading or your maths or your written language, whatever it is that there's an issue. And then, you know, you go back into regular class. And also they've got kids with intellectual disability. I mean, they've got all sorts, but really most of their special ed was just regular kids that had a reading or a maths or written language issue. So I would do these assessments, and at the time, ADHD was not a handicapping condition. And the reason was just political. And I didn't know that at the time. The reason was that Texas passed the special education law for Texas using DSM-2. And in DSM-2, ADHD was classified as minimal brain damage. But in DSM-3, they changed it to ADHD, inattentive, impulsive, whatever. And I would say, oh, ADHD inattentive, and that was not qualifying them for special ed. So all these kids that should have qualified for special ed didn't get in. And eventually they said to me, okay, these kids won't qualify for special ed, but we need some help with them. So I started just assessing kids who had issues with attention and focus. And so I would just sit in these classrooms, and really the teachers were so accommodating and really so good. I saw some incredibly good teachers dealing with these kids. You know, I remember one teacher had this kid who was just so hyperactive, and she gave him a little table that he would stand at, and he would just do circuits around the table. And then, you know, he would do his work, and the rest of the class was quiet. And you know, these are amazing, to me, amazing ways of dealing with kids. But anyway, so I'll observe these kids, and you'd see these bright ADHD kids crawling around on the floor and doing this in grade 2, grade 3, and the teacher would ask them a question, and they just answer the question. Bright ones. But the kids that weren't so bright, they just weren't absorbing the work. And yeah, there was a problem, because you know, by the time these kids get to grade 6, grade 7, they're in big trouble, because that's when you have to do written work. And that's how you know that somebody's got ADHD, is the written work. The oral work they can do, they can answer questions, they're engaged, but once you have to get them to write, they just can't do it. And so, you know, this is what you would start seeing. So I just refer these kids off to the physicians, to the pediatricians, and they'd give them Ritalin. And for a lot of the kids, the Ritalin worked fine. And so I've never had an issue, you know, against medication, because when it works really well. And that to me is really a positive thing. However, there were times when Ritalin didn't work. And usually these were the kids that had behavior problems. And either because they had developed behavior problems, or they were oppositional as well, and there were family issues, or now what we understand is they might have been on the spectrum, the Ritalin wasn't doing a great job. And back then I already saw them using clonidine, Catapres, to help calm people down. And clonidine is still a really good medication to use, more for somebody with excess beta. But those sorts of kids, when they're little, oh man, they are movers and shakers. They're going. So anyway, those are the sorts of kids. And another story I remember was with these kids who are taking medicine. You know, the kids often just didn't like to take the medicine. Either they just had something against it, or they didn't like whatever it was. Maybe it slowed them down too much. I don't know. So there was one kid who had to take his medicine, and the teacher would give him his pill, and he'd go outside and he'd go to the water fountain, and then he had to take his medicine and come back to class. And for some reason, the medicine didn't seem to be working. So we sort of tracked what was going on, and we went outside, and next to the water fountain was outside, there was a little garden, and arranged on the edge of the garden were about 30 pills just planted one next to the other. So this is what he was doing with his ADHD pills. So yeah, I mean, those are issues. And of course, the older kids, once they're teenagers, they'll often sell the pills because you get a buzz by taking them. So there are issues. There are issues with taking the medicine. And the other place I worked in America, and this was a city of about 70,000 people, so not a big city. And there were, it serviced an area maybe 250,000 people. And I worked in juvenile justice doing assessments on kids that have broken the law. The amount of violent crime that I saw there in this small city was heaps more than I saw in Melbourne when I came here in 1992 and worked at the Children's Court Clinic, the equivalent. And the level of violence and the extremity of the violence, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, this is what teenagers were doing. And you just go, and this is a city of 70,000? Forget Dallas, forget Houston. You know, this is, and, you know, this is all over the United States. And I think, you know, we all see every day this sort of violence that really has not found some sort of outlet in the United States to this day. Anyway, I did meet my wife there, so that's a wonderful thing. And we had 3 beautiful children in America. And then we came back to Australia, and I worked at the Children's Court Clinic in Melbourne. And the beauty of working at the Children's Court Clinic at that time was that we only worked at the pleasure of the magistrates. So we did protection. So when kids were removed by the Department of Human Services, and we did youth offending, which is delinquency. And the department could not order us to do a report. It was only the magistrates. So it was really nice because you didn't have to be on anybody's side. You just write the report. And the person who I was working under then is a legend, Patricia Brown. She was really a truly amazing person. And I could tell you stories about her, but I won't. We'll move on. But she was really an amazing individual. And she ran that clinic and ran it at a very high level. So we did assessments. And the other thing that I did is I became a therapist at the Western Hospital Child and Adolescent Mental Health Unit. So a government child and adolescent unit, an outpatient unit in the western part of Melbourne. And anybody who knows anything about the western part of Melbourne knows that all services are really quite poor in the west part of Melbourne. The money is in the east, and that's where all the services are. So, you know, we were dealing with people that really did not have access to very many services. And this was a family therapy oriented place. And I'd had a bit of exposure to family therapy, not a whole lot of learning. But I remember attending a conference while I was still in America. And the guy who founded family therapy in Texas, his name was Harold Gulishian. And he would talk about the essence of family therapy. And he would say, yes, in a family system, you have to understand. And he would say, this is what I say. You know, to a woman, he would say, honey, and to a man, he would say, son. He would go, son, if you keep doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep getting what you've been getting. And this was his dictum, but it's a really true family therapy dictum, which is, if you want the system to change, you've got to do something. And of course, that's what family therapists do. They figure out how to affect change in a family. But in this particular place in Western Hospital Sunshine, they were so entrenched that they didn't believe that ADHD existed. Now, you know, I'd been diagnosing ADHD, sending people for medicine for years. And I just thought, oh my God, okay, so you can be family therapy and you can be rigid too. Okay. And they just said that it was a result of a family dynamic. But of course, then if you try to change the family dynamic, you won't change the ADHD. Mm. So everybody feels like they've failed, which is not a great outcome. So I worked there for a while. And then I started studying a psychotherapy, and it's called Hakomi therapy, and it's a body-centered psychotherapy. And I didn't study it because of trauma necessarily. That wasn't the reason. I just really thought there was a beautiful therapy. And there was one quote I mentioned to Mariana before. Ron Kurtz, the guy who started it, wrote in his book, he said, psychotherapy is not a problem to fix. It's a relationship to have. And to me, it's like that in one sentence encapsulates our work.
Yes.
That relationship is everything. If you have a good relationship, everything is going to work better. And that to me means you honor and respect the person you're working with. You don't push them around. You don't threaten them in any way. You don't do any sort of violence against them. You support them. And that's really what Hakomi was about. And those of you who know Pat Ogden, she basically studied with Ron and then developed her own trauma-based work with somatic psychotherapy. But it is Hakomi, I mean, her work is Hakomi psychotherapy. So that to me was really, and it's always been a huge piece of how I've approached working with people generally, is support them. Don't negate them. Don't cut off their hope. Give them hope. Find a way to do that. And listen. Anyway, soon after that, when I started the training, one of my buddies, Paul Holman, he's a retired psychiatrist. He's a guy who's been instrumental in bringing what was it called? Nutritional medicine to Australia. He's taught nutritional medicine for years and written books on it. Really interesting guy. And we were training together. We were training Hakomi. And he said to me that there's this guy in Sydney who's doing this neurofeedback thing. And he said, you know, you can work with kids without medication, ADHD kids. And, you know, I just said, oh, no, pull the other leg, because everything that I'd ever seen was that the only real way to deal with ADHD is medication. And he said, no, go and visit this guy. So I went to see Alex Sevitt in Crow's Nest. And, you know, I see these kids sitting there, ADHD kids sitting there quietly looking at a screen. And I'm going, this is interesting. Then I looked at some of the research that was there. And I said, I'm in, because I'd already understood ADHD. I'd already seen lots of kids with ADHD. And I'd seen that the only thing that makes a difference is medication. And since I'm not a physician, I want to do something that's going to do something for these kids. And neurofeedback could do it. So I bought in, and I went to my first conference, I think, in sometime around Easter in 1998. And Susan and Siegfried Ottman were there. And she basically introduced me to neurofeedback and taught some of the fundamentals about it. And I bought the equipment right then and there. And there was this other guy there called Tom Allen, who was from Florida, and he was a big believer in QEEG. And he got up and he just said, well, unless you do QEEG, you really don't know what's going on with the client, and you shouldn't do any neurofeedback until you've done QEEG. And I'm thinking to myself, I mean, I was just flat, and it was like I just got completely deflated, because I already put in a lot of thought into trying to figure out what neurofeedback's about. And then this guy gets up and says, no, what you've learned, no, it's not it. So I went and complained bitterly to Susan Ottman, and she just said, don't worry. He is what he is, don't worry. That's not the way it is. But it really made me understand, and that may be one of the reasons why to this day I champion mini-maps. And I tell people, in a lot of instances, you really don't need a QEEG. And if you ask Seaburn Fisher, she says, of course not. She doesn't even need mini-maps, but that's Seaburn too. I mean, she's been doing it for a long time. So yeah, that was Tom Allen. And the other thing that I saw there was a guy was presenting on the TOBA, which is a great test for ADHD. So I also bought the TOBA, and that's really how I started. That's how I started doing neurofeedback, and just started working with ADHD kids, and immediately started seeing these kids calming down. And I published something a few years in, and it showed very clearly that ADHD is really changed by doing neurofeedback, along with lots of other studies that have been published in that area. Interestingly, at that first conference, Rob Bushkins my good friend, and he was my first teacher in neurofeedback, Rob was there, and he was the tech for EEG Spectrum back then. And fairly soon after that, Alex bowed out, and Rob and Tamara Lawrenson took over running Eager. And Rob went on and became the first president of ISNR in Australia. Very important role. And he really solidified neurofeedback in Australia. And later on, he invited me to come teach with him. Of course, I grabbed that with both hands. I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to teach this stuff. And that would have been, I think, 2000 or 2001. And we taught together for, I think, about 10 years, and did a lot of lovely conferences, had a lot of great folks come to Australia, taught a lot of people, and really had a lot of fun with it. And for me, that's really been the thing that I've enjoyed most, is really the excitement about seeing things change when you're doing this weird thing where you just attach sensors to somebody's head and show them their own EEG or whatever, and then things change. I mean, that still blows me away. I still get excited every time I see that. So that was a really great piece for me that Rob took me on, and that we worked together. And a little while after that, I decided I'd get into QEEG. I figured, well, might as well start now. And I bought Barry Sturman's system for starters and looked at that a bit, and then heard all about Bob Thatcher's stuff and NeuroGuide. So I bought that and started working with it. And then I got into Rob Coben talking about Hudspeth and his database for connectivity, and looked at that, and that was another form of QEEG, and all of it involved a lot of analysis and a lot of transformation of data. That's all of those things involved. You've got to transform it. And truth be known, I really didn't get a whole lot out of all of that stuff. And I even wrote reports. I'm a bit embarrassed. Wrote reports for people. I don't think they were very good. And, you know, just thinking about what this stuff is doing. And in the end, I just kept on going back to the symptoms. You know, the symptoms seemed to work. And all of this QEEG stuff to me wasn't actually giving me anything more. So I left it until John Haig came up to me one day and he said, "Hey, I've been studying this QEEG stuff with Jay Gunkelman. You need to get your head around that."
Before we move into quantitative EEG, there are a few questions that are related to assessment, and I think are related to the first part of your talk. And just to tell everyone, at the end, we will have time for questions and answers. But there are a few questions that might be good to answer now because they really relate to what you were mentioning.
Sure.
First question was related to Luria. Question is, few assessment tests, Luria, if you use them, the Cube and Cross, for example. So did you use Luria, and are you still using some of the assessment tools then?
Look, I saw the Luria Nebraska, right? I learned the Halstead Raytan. The Luria Nebraska came out and I sort of had a look at it, but didn't have time to really get into it. I don't know that I ever did any of that Luria Nebraska. I bought the manuals, I had a look at them, but I don't recall anymore. So that's really, I think the piece where Luria was just so far ahead of the game was that he basically told us what the functions of the lobes are. And he just outlined it. And he did that before anybody else did. Now we just accept it. You know, it's just become, oh yeah, that's the way it is. Frontal lobe does this, temporal lobes do this, parietal lobes does, you know. He did all that, and he did that in the 1940s. You know, because it took 20 years for the stuff to get translated. You know, so it only appeared in America, in the West, in the 60s. But, you know, it was a 1945 or 47 book that they translated. And even then it was years ahead of what we were studying in neuropsych.
So
You know,
from all assessments, sorry, Moshe, from all assessments that you learned, what assessment was the most useful for you as neurofeedback practitioner? What did you find that is really essential? Because we can do, as you said, you can go to neuropsych and you can have hours and hours of assessment, how useful that is for neurofeedback and what is really minimum or what is really optimal level of assessment that it really informs your practice.
Yeah, well, since I did a lot of work with ADHD, to me, the TOVA is really a terrific test. And it's a terrific test because you can just look at the results of the test and you can tell the parents how this kid is in a regular classroom situation. You can describe what the kid is doing and you're going to be right about 90% of the time. Now, that is an incredibly good test. The alternative to that is the IVA, which is not nearly as good at doing that. It just does not describe it the same way. It doesn't do it. And, you know, the drawback to the TOVA is that for people who have auditory processing issues, you probably do want to use the auditory form of the TOVA. But what makes TOVA so good is also what makes it so bad. Is that it is boring. The TOVA is so boring. But you see, you're not going to separate people who have attention problems from people who don't have attention problems unless you give them a boring test. Because if it's interesting, everybody focuses, right? It's got to be boring. But, you know, you give somebody, I gave my daughter, right at the start, I gave my daughter the TOVA. And she looked at me, and she would have been 12 or 13. I don't know how old she was afterwards. She looked at me afterwards. She said, I will never take that test again. It's like, okay, you know, that's the TOVA. So you do get that reaction. So sometimes you've only got one chance until the kid is really a lot better. Like if you give the TOVA to an oppositional kid, right? They'll give you one TOVA, but until they've stopped being oppositional, you're never going to get another good TOVA out of them. But the same is true for the IVA. I mean, you know, it's boring. So they just don't want to do it. And with kids on the spectrum, not the ones that are really more severe, but the high functioning autistic kids, they'll actually give you one good TOVA, but they won't give you two until you've really changed them, right? So yeah, I'd say that the TOVA for anything that looks like ADHD is a great test, not just a good test, a great test. And I think that just understanding symptoms, whatever it is, whatever way you understand symptoms, whether you ask them questions or give them checklists, or because, you know, when you interview people, you never get the whole story the first time, never. Because they don't know who you are. They can't open up. They can't tell you everything the first time. It's just not possible. So it's a matter of slowly asking the questions. And for me, sleep is always the number one issue, always. Did you sleep well? Number one question. If they slept well, then that's a whole area you don't have to mess with. But if they didn't sleep well, you got to find out. And I don't call things disorder. I call them temperament. What sort of temperament does this person have? Is it an active go-getter, executive type temperament, or is it a dreamy, creative, artistic temperament? You know, those are just temperaments, they're styles. So where does this person fit? And then, of course, you layer on that trauma, which then activates everybody. And if it's developmental trauma, then it just messes up their temperament too. I mean, you know, you start looking at that stuff, but that, to me, that investigation, it's not really a test, it's an investigation. There's a test that John Hegg loves, the CRC 20 or 100 or something, that lots of questions, and at the end you get these pictures of where the issues are in the brain. I've never used that test, but it's a really good test. I mean, that's an interesting one to help you say, oh, okay, let's localize this. Let's see where these symptoms should fit on the brain. That looks like an interesting test, although I don't know, it came on the scene after I was already doing what I was doing, so I couldn't be bothered getting it. And then the other place is just looking at the EEG. You know, I mean, for me, you want to find verification in the symptoms in the EEG, because if you do find verification, you say, yeah, that pattern in their EEG, that's consistent with what they're reporting, then you know you can train that and you're probably going to get a result, right? So I don't look at an EEG or a mini-map or a QEEG to say, how am I going to train? I don't look at it that way. I say, what patterns here support the symptoms they're reporting to me? And if I find that, then I go, okay, I can go there. So, you know, you can get, and I love Jay and his phenotypes. So those of you who are familiar with phenotypes in the EEG, by looking at FZ, CZ, and PZ, you can get about 8 of the 15 phenotypes I know of, 8 or 9. Well, that's not bad. 6 minutes work, and you can identify 8 or 9 phenotypes. Now, if it's a complex case, you probably want to do a Q. You know, there's all sorts of stuff going on. There's brain injury, there's abuse, you know, there's all sorts of really heavy duty stuff. Okay, you do want to know what's going on in the temporal lobes and the back of the head. You know, you do want to know that. You could do mini-map on all the different spots, but it's more elegant to do a Q or to get somebody else to do one. But if you want to know high order functioning in the brain, mini-map, and that confirms what you're seeing or lets you know. Like if somebody comes in with ADHD, no slow wave in their EEG, no fast wave in their EEG, no alpha in their EEG that's excessive. Neurofeedback's probably not going to do anything for them. Start looking for a family dynamic. I mean, you know, that to me is the place. You know, you want to see that the EEG doesn't fit. And the opposite is true too. If I see a person who's really functioning very well, and I look at their EEG and I go, oh my God, you're an adult and you've got 22 microvolts of theta in the front of your brain. How do you do it? Right? I've seen that. And you go, what's going on? Usually you got 22 microvolts of theta in the front of your brain. You're just not focused. And here's this person who's doing really well. So what you realize is this person is super bright and super capable. And then you go, okay, we're going to tweak your brain and you ain't seen nothing yet from what you're capable of doing. In other words, you know, you've had something dragging you down. Now we're going to, right? And even for creative people, you know, the issue with too much theta is that they have the ideas, they can start creating, but they never finish the job. And, you know, a creative person has to also finish the job. So, yeah, it's really interesting. So you're always looking for confirmation of things in the EEG. Look, and every now and again, you just see somebody's EEG and you just go, oh, there's epileptiform activity. Huh. You know, and it's not showing up because they're not having seizures, but it's still there. And you go, well, we know exactly where we've got to train. You know, and sometimes the EEG just says that's where you're going to train. So, you know, you do get that sometimes in a EEG or a QEEG, but a lot of the time you don't, you know, and I mean, that's my experience. So that's the answer.
So what would be percentage of cases where you think really QEEG or EEG made a big difference? And what is percentage that maybe could train based on symptoms that clients are presenting?
Well, I mean, in my practice, I just did a Q every time somebody came in. That was just standard for me. I just did it. But if you do a mini-map standard, you can look at higher order functioning in this person, attention, focus, emotional regulation, right? Those are big deals. And you can see if there's going to be any issue with any of those by looking along that midline. That's a really good start. You know, now somebody who's got a learning disability and otherwise functions really well, nah, you're probably not going to see much there. You might see it if you do the temporal lobes. But so for me, I think the QEEGs or an in-depth EEG analysis is good about a third of, I think about a third of the time, you just look at it and you go, oh, that's probably where we're going to train. You see really outrageous events happening at some spot in the EEG. So, oh, that's where we're going to train. A third of the time, you go, oh yeah, well, there's this and there's this and there's this and this fits with the symptoms and da 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 da. And so we're going to train. And about a third of the time, you get low amplitude fast wave EEG. It's like being in the desert for me. There's nothing going on in this EEG. It's just low amplitude fast wave. Yep, they're just activated and that's it. There's nothing else. So you're just left with symptoms, you know.
And Moshe, if you can also then tell us what would be clinical presentation where you would really want to have quantitative EEG? Because not everyone has access to quantitative EEG. But when you have clients, and what would be presentations where you would like to check their EEG as well?
Somebody who's got an acquired brain injury, for sure. Somebody who's got pretty severe PTSD, and on top of that, things like chronic pain and autoimmune issues. You know, those cases are, you never know what else has been going on in their brains. And you just want to see what's going on. And let's see who else. I mean, the standard sort of thing is if you work with somebody for a while and you're just not getting any progress, you go, let's have another look. Let's see what else might be happening in this EEG. You know, that to me is another reason. I think people that have pretty severe learning disabilities, it's worth having a look. But even with the QEEG, it's often hit and miss to figure out how to train learning disabilities, because, you know, they may have some sort of language-based issue, but whether it's at the perceptual level, whether it's at the integrative level, whether it's at the working memory level, hard to know, because everything's feeding back. You know, what's happening at the front of the brain is just feeding back to the back of the brain. And then that's informing the back of the brain what to process. And, you know, I mean, it's like, so where is the issue? And, you know, we think of the basal ganglia as being instrumental in organizing movement, which they are, but they're also fundamental in perception. And you go, what? No. Got to separate this out. No, you know, so you go, yeah, it's like everything's feeding back onto itself. So once you see things like learning disabilities, you just go, okay, what are we seeing? You know, you try to figure out, is it visual? Is it more auditory? Right? I mean, you try to figure it out, or is it both? You know, I mean, and that sort of gives you some clues. Okay, where might we go? But I mean, you got the whole back of the head. Where are we going to put the senses? And my experience has not been very successful with doing, what do we call it? Coherence trainings. I mean, I've tried all sorts of coherence trainings and looked at the stuff. And I mean, you know, Rob Coben is the man. If you love coherence training, go see Rob Coben. And, you know, and then get ready to go on a learning curve that I didn't want to go on, which is not just QEEG, it's in-depth QEEG, and it's more analysis and more analysis and more analysis. And maybe at the end of that, something good comes of it. I mean, but for me, the excess analysis is something that none of us can afford. I can't afford to do that, you know. So he's really interesting. And if he comes up with some surefire ways of doing coherence well, go for it. And I'd say that for anything, regardless of what I say. If you find a method that works, that, you know, I'm saying, nah, that I badmouth, just do it. And just drop me a line and say, well, you know, I'm doing it and it works really well. And I'm happy because I'm not wedded to one way of doing anything. It doesn't matter. You know, if it works, it works. So, yeah.
Moshe, our listeners are also asking about protocols, and it might be a good time to tell us a little bit about your experiences and what are your most often used protocols when you work with children with ADHD, and maybe to touch also on other presentations that you find with different clinical presentations.
Well, you know, for good kids from good families who are just impulsive, Dennis the Menace, right? He's a great guy, doesn't want to be in trouble, but there's a trail of wreckage behind him. That's ADHD impulsive. What are you going to do, right? When you get somebody like that, C4 minus A2 rewarding 12 to 15, I mean, it's pretty much straightforward. And, you know, if you're a fan of Joel Lubar and Martijn Arns, CZ minus A2 rewarding 12 to 15. You know, it's like, okay, one or the other, it doesn't matter, both work, right? And if you've got somebody who's just dreamy, you know, Moisha, it's time to do your work. Earth to Moisha, come in. You know, it's like, oh, I've got to do my work, you know, got to do my work. You can't go past C3 minus A1 reward 15 to 18. It's pretty straightforward. Now, you know, the research says CZ minus A1 reward 15 to 18. Fine. You know, I don't see much difference between them actually, but, you know, whatever. F3 minus A1, CZ minus A1 rewarding 15 to 18. They'll all work. And there's no research I've seen that differentiates, you know, so that's the simple stuff. Now, once you start getting complexities, you know, it starts to shift. Then you got to look for other things that are going on. And if they're bright and oppositional, I think you can still get by with that. But maybe you have to use the midline because when they're oppositional, they're stuck. And that's a frontal central FZ-CZ issue. That's where you get stuckness. So you go, oh, what about C4 minus PZ a bit and then C3 minus FZ a bit? And by the way, that's Susan Ottmer's protocol, isn't it? It's like, this is nothing new. It's just that what Susan did was she would find a great protocol and then she would move on. And then she would say, oh no, that's no good. I'm doing this now. And it's not no good. It's just that it doesn't work for everybody, but that's okay. So if you want to get the midline involved because they're stuck, they're oppositional, they're non-compliant, you know, that sort of, you start using FZ and PZ, you get them involved a bit in it. Okay. Then, you know, you start seeing kids that are highly anxious. And you start seeing those kids when they've got, sometimes with excess alpha as well. And there's a difference. Excess theta, they're just inattentive and they don't really care. Yeah, life goes on. If they've got excess alpha, centrally with eyes open, centrally, frontally sometimes, they're anxious too. And then you've got to deal with alpha. And alpha, you know, if you lose vigilance even a tiny little bit, your alpha just explodes. And then you get focused again, your alpha goes right down. Okay, how do you inhibit that? You know, you set the inhibit at some level and then whoop, then they're not getting any reward at all. And then, so you open it up and then they focus and then it goes back down again. So yeah, playing with alpha is always fun, right? And the two other cases you can think of easily when somebody's got excess alpha is if it's at CZ, you might be dealing with dissociation and trauma, you know, because that's one of the things that I say to people when you see alpha with eyes open at CZ, start wondering, start asking some questions about trauma, dissociation, really. At FZ, if the alpha's a bit too big, you start asking about obsessive overfocus and you wouldn't be far wrong. You know, I mean, so then, you know, see, then it starts getting complicated. This is not just ADHD anymore. It's other stuff. And then then you think, okay, what are we going to do for this? And what are we going to do for this? And the funniest thing that I've ever found is when I'm mentoring somebody and I'll say, well, what have you tried? And they say they try something and that's something that I would never do, right? Never. And they got great results. And I'm going, oh, okay. And that's the nature of the field, is that people have intuitions or hunches about something that they want to do, and they try it. And I'm not that sort of person. I don't do that. I'm slow and steady. That's how I like to do things. But there are a lot of people that just try something, and a lot of the time it works. And you say, well, does that make the field haphazard? And I don't think so. I think that gradually we're building this mosaic of what neurofeedback is about and what the brain is about. And we know a few tracks into this wilderness. In other words, some of that puzzle we've put together fairly well at this point. But there are bits of it that are just uncharted yet. And it's like, how do we influence this system? That's really the question. Because if I'm training at C3, I'm not training movement in the right hand. That's not what I'm training, because that's exactly what sits underneath it. What I'm training is the thalamus to regulate, right? So I have to get into some sort of network. And the question is, how do you get into the network? And it's sort of like family therapy. You know, you've got 5 people in front of you in a family, and one of them's having a lot of trouble, the identified patient. Okay, how do you move this system so this kid will stop suffering, let's say? How do you do that? And in the brain, I think we're faced with that issue. And how do you impact a system, right? And, you know, I mean, you see that all the time. Seaburn Fisher says, oh, train FPO2 for fear. And it works. And Seaburn's theory is we're influencing the amygdala on the right side of the brain. And Jay Gungman says, well, no, the amygdala has no EEG on the outside of it. You cannot influence the EEG of the amygdala. Okay, so what are we doing, right? Well, it works. So there's got to be something that's going on here. And my guess is probably that you're influencing the right orbitofrontal cortex. That would be my thought. But I don't have any proof. But, you know, you look at that, and we've got all sorts of things that work, like O1 minus O2 for trauma. Oh, we're influencing the periaqueductal gray matter. And I've looked at a side view of the head showing where we're putting the sensors and how far you have to go in to get to periaqueductal gray matter. And I'm going, really? Is that what we're doing? And yet, you know, there are results. So it's not haphazard. It's like, how do we get into the system? And, you know, that for me is really what the question is for the researchers, is what are the networks? And how do we influence the networks? And we already reliably know, you know, that beta and SMR can reliably influence networks. And we know that in trauma, theta and even delta can reliably influence networks. We know that from experience, but exactly what's going on, we don't know yet. So people come up with these amazing protocols that work. And I just say, keep a record of that and see how far you can push that envelope with the next patient that comes in. Because, you know, you're onto something here. So there you go.
Moshe, you've trained and mentored many practitioners in this field. What is your take on, or what are the main ingredients to help someone? What did you do as a mentor to help someone really master neurofeedback and become really proficient in what they're doing? What did you find that is really working, and how can you as a teacher and mentor support someone's development?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is get them to try to do stuff. You know, just do something. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, stop. You know, give me a call, talk to me, email me, let me know, and we'll figure something out. In other words, you know, if you don't fail, you can't learn. I mean, it's so simple. You know, if you never fail, you never learn. So you have to try. So you do something. And so. So you've got to have enough tenacity to stick with it long enough to see it through. That's first. And then, you know, by the by, if there's some piece that they're missing or they need to learn or they need to understand, I'll explain it to them. But really, the most important thing is to try stuff and see where it takes you and learn that you can adjust. That, you know, the first thing you do is not necessarily the only thing you can do. And that's really, to me, the really important piece. And then people are scrambling to learn stuff. You know, I mean, anybody who's in this field is just learning, reading, learning, going here, trying this, looking. I mean, you know, so that just continues anyway. And they'll come to me and say, well, such and such said this and such said this and such, and, you know, and I'm going, great. Okay, let's look at that. Let's see how that might help what you're doing now, you know, which is, and that's, you know, that to me. So that's support. And, you know, the folks that stick with it become really good at what they're doing, you know, but they also have to overcome a mindset, which is doing neurofeedback when you've never done any sort of biofeedback before is weird. It's not within the normal psychotherapy framework. And so people actually have to get their head around that. And I think that when people train, you know, they do a training in it, many of them, the idea, they thought it might settle and work for them, but it doesn't. And that's fair enough, you know, but then there are those who know, yeah, this has got something and I want to understand it more. You know, they invest, they buy equipment, not cheap, and then they start learning. And then to me, it's like, you've got to encourage that. And to me, I encourage people to learn in whatever way works for them. And there are a lot of teachers out there, and there are a lot of different ways of understanding. And you find somebody who you get them, they get you. And that's what you want. You know,
how important is self-training, so that those who are learning also train themselves?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, training yourself is always interesting. Yeah, when I train myself, usually nothing happens, you know. So I train myself, I don't notice anything. I mean, maybe my head's a bit like a block of wood. So, you know, I try at various times, okay, now I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this, see what happens. Every now and again, I get a reaction. But I've got, you know, I've got an EEG that's a bit like a desert. It's just this low amplitude, fast wave EEG and nothing happens in it. You know, I go, oh, well, what am I going to do? So the only protocol that I do is the alpha diminish. That's what's her name's protocol?
Alpha down, root
yeah,
lanyard.
alpha down. Yeah. I like that because I do get a bit of a rebound afterwards, you know. But yeah, you train yourself and you see what stuff does. But you've got to be careful because the more sensitive you are, the more you're going to react to stuff.
Moshe, questions around system that you use. Is it Eager or Signet? Also, what are other conditions apart from ADHD where your feedback is beneficial? And then also there is one question about mode of feedback, whether video, is it important? What is the feedback type that we use? So
Yeah.
if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Look, I think that neurofeedback is really helpful for a lot of different things. I mean, ADHD is one. All levels of trauma, neurofeedback's helpful. ASD, it's really helpful. It's helpful for a lot of forms of anxiety. It's helpful for a lot of issues with sleep. Once you move beyond that, you start going to things, well, brain injury, or also straight up, brain injury will help, you know. Then you start getting into areas where not so easy to find the right protocols. Chronic pain, is not so easy as far as I'm concerned. Maybe there are people who get really good results a lot of the time with chronic pain. I've not worked with a whole lot of chronic pain folks, but it's tricky. Learning disabilities, sure, we can work and we can help, but you have to be willing to experiment with a lot of different protocols at the back of the head. And I don't care if you start with QEEGs or not, it's still going to be difficult. Yeah, and the more complex cases, and with trauma, you have to integrate your work with psychotherapy. There's no other way to do it. So you're going to do a bit of this and a bit of that, and teasing out what is working. I mean, who cares? I mean, at this point, you do it because you can see it gives you better results, and you can see you can get at the stuff more easily. I don't know if that answers the question. If somebody's got a specific, they can ask me, you know, what about this or what about this? In terms of what form of feedback works best, you know, the folks that taught me are all really pretty strict behaviorists. And for them, it's sort of like they live in this world that's made up of discrete events. It's got to be this or it's got to be this. You've got to respond to this and you've got to respond to this. The fact of the matter is that behaviorism is an insult even to the rat, because the rat is capable of doing so much more than pressing a bar for food. But if you make the rat hungry, sure, it'll press a bar for food. But if you allow that rat to do other things, then it can do a lot more than that. And so it is for human beings. Our ability to take in information and see patterns is incredible. This is what our brain does. As soon as you open your eyes, your brain is looking for patterns. You don't have to tell it to do so, it just does it. So you get on the train to go to work in the good old days when we could get on a train and go to work. Yes, you know, but remember the good old days when we could get on public transportation. All right. You get on a train to go to work and you notice a person in the crowd. For some reason, you notice them. The next day, you notice them. A month later, you notice them. You don't know who they are. You notice the face. That's pattern recognition. Our brains are so good at pattern recognition. And of course, faces, of course, are really a big deal for humans, right? So we're really good at facial recognition. But how many faces have you got stored in your memory? Bang, you can pick them out. You know, I've seen that face before. That to me is the issue with neurofeedback. Another example why black and white is not really what I think about, and why, for me, it doesn't have to be beep, beep, beep as the only way to get feedback. I think screen going darker and lighter, I think works just as well. When you were growing up, unless you had extraordinary parents, they often disagreed on how to discipline you. So if you wanted to do A, you went to your mother. If you wanted to do B, you went to your father.
Like my children.
How old were you when you figured that out? 2, 3, right? In other words, we don't need totally consistent feedback in order to learn, right? We get it really fast. And I got a 4.5-year-old grandson, and I tell you what, he knows exactly what to say to get what he wants. Yeah, he knows which parent to ask. He knows which grandparent to ask, right? So this idea that things have to be very consistent and black and white is, I think it's just reminiscent of behaviorism. And behaviorism is true in the way it works, but human beings have got much more capacity. So videos, I've used videos for years and they've trained fine. So I don't look at the discrete as the issue.
And what is the system that you use? There was a question around Eager or Signet, or what is the system that you use in your practice? And
Yeah.
also Minikue, with what system Minikue can be?
Okay. Look, I think that any system that you use where you can actually adjust in session is an instrument that is worth using. Now, of course, I've been an eager man. Okay, eager does that. But BrainMaster, I think, also can do that. I think that Thought Technology can do that. I don't know about Cygnet. I just don't know their system. But, you know, the more expensive systems can probably do that. There's a way to do it. In BrainMaster, what you get is you get a series of set protocols that you can choose. You know, activation, calming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just choose one, right? But then you can actually open the bonnet. You can look inside, and then you can change whatever you want to change. I think you can do that in session, but it'll do the job. The amplifiers are good. The software does the job, and it'll do it. The things like BioExplorer, the UWIS, it's fairly primitive. I don't know if you can adjust in the session, but you know, I know people have been using it for years and get really good results with it. So it works, obviously. We do sell Betterfly. Betterfly is a per session. So the moment you go into the session, you just paid for it. It's a per session. So it's good for us as clinicians because you make money. Every time they go into a session, you make money. On the other hand, if they go in for 3 minutes and then leave, that just cost them a session, right? So if you do brief training, it can be quite expensive for them to have to pay each time, but you can't adjust in the session, right? So to me, when you want to do more complex work, you do want to be able to adjust in the session so it doesn't interrupt the flow of the session. Any of those that will actually give you readouts of EEG at the end, average readouts, you can get a Minimap out of. And there are some really nice Minimap systems around that have been around for 20 years. And people use them and people like them. So I can't remember the names of the guys now, but if somebody reminds me, I'll say, yeah, that's the one. I mean, they've been around for a long time and people use them and like them. So I'm going, okay, they work.
And Moshe, question is also about what is the difference then between traditional neurofeedback and lens? Because it's not just about...
Yeah. Well, like many other things, I bought Lens too, and I've used Lens, and I found Lens can be really good for brain injury. Now, other people have found Lens useful for a lot of other things besides brain injury. They've gotten into it. And so I'm not an expert on Lens, but I have bought it and I have used it and I know about it. And the thing that always made me a little skittish was there's a pretty high price tag on it. You've got to pay a lot of money for this thing. And when you're paying a lot of money for something, you want to know there's some research behind it, that this is not just something that Len Oakes just goes, oh, well, you know, we don't know why it works, but it works. And then he smiles like, come on, I need something a little more solid. Now, there's not a big research base behind it, which is problematic. But I thought, you know what happens if I do neurofeedback on somebody with my system, an EEG system, for 20 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute? What will happen? And see, the issue with the people that we work with is that some of them are extremely sensitive. And if you try doing 30 minutes of training with somebody like that, oh my God, they're going to suffer for months afterwards because their systems just can't take that. You're not actually training the brain, you're actually pushing the brain because their systems sort of cascade. That seems to be what happens. And I'm going, well, if Len Oakes can do it with Lens, why can't we do it with Eager? So I've done that with Eager with brief sessions and I've gotten good results. Now, I'm not saying, oh yeah, you can compare this to Len Oakes. I'm not saying that. And there is a wealth of information about how to do protocols. And if you're getting into lens, look at Nick Dogres. Nick Dogres does stimulation. And Nick wrote most of Len Oakes's protocols before he left Len Oakes, all right? So I would say dial up Nick Dogres. And, you know, if you're young enough and you're ready for a ride, because his stuff is really interesting and he does some really beautiful work. So, you know, that to me is something to look at. I worked with a girl who had she had a lot of allergies, a lot of issues. And then she got hit by I think a baseball bat, and she was 12 or 13, and that was it. She couldn't go to school. She couldn't do anything. She couldn't do a work, nothing. And we would do 3 minutes of training every week. And she just came back to life. 3 minutes. And we then spaced it out and did 3 minutes every 2 weeks because she couldn't be bothered coming in. And she still kept on improving. So what I would say is that the more sensitive your client is, start with a very, very small amount of neurofeedback and see if that works. If not, increase it a bit. And if you still want to explore Len Oakes, by all means do it, because there's truth in it. It works. Okay.
Moshe, you spent 20 years in this field, working in this field. You developed your own institute, teaching and mentoring others. You really contributed to development of neurofeedback field in Australia, and I think more than just in Australia. So what are your plans now? Where to from now?
Well, of course, none of us plans what is going to happen in our lives. If we think we do, that's great, but you know, life happens. And for me, you know, just being able to share stuff, being able to help people, and being able to introduce that to people, for me, that's fulfillment. And I've also been able to make a living doing it, so it's nice. You know, it's for me just to remember and to thank the people that have made this journey. You know, that's always. And now, I mean, I'll still tinker with neurofeedback a bit and do a bit of teaching here and there and gradually let it go. And then, you know, I've got time for singing and photography, and I'm learning how to play bridge, which is sort of fun. So that's what's coming.
What type of singing? What type of singing?
Oh, well, I have a singing teacher who was trained classical. So he likes me to sing in all these different languages, which is hilarious. So I have to learn how to sing in Italian and have to learn how to sing in German. And I've even had to learn how to sing in French, which is, wow. The mouth has to do some strange things to sing in those languages, but it's really nice. And some of the songs are just wonderful. You know, just amazing, beautiful, beautiful songs. And yeah, it's just lovely to be able to sing them. And then I, you know, every now and again I'll say, okay, did Pavarotti sing this one? So you get Pavarotti singing it, and then you just go, oh my God. And you go, wow. Or Edita Gruberova. You know, it's like, and you cannot believe how some of those great ones sing it. It's just lovely. So, yep, that's what's coming.
I remember, Moshe, you spent one night with us in Sydney, and you were preparing to sing in a synagogue, and you asked if you can sing, and it was night, and it was really beautiful song, because it was in Hebrew. We didn't really understand, but that night I had terrible nightmare. But my husband actually had a dream about exodus of Serbs from Balkans, and actually you were singing about exodus from Egypt, isn't it? It was one of the Bible stories, and it was really interesting. Even if you don't understand the language, you still can get the meaning through your singing was really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, art is really about, to me, is about what is deepest in us. You know, the longing that every human being has for something that's bigger, you know, that to connect to in some way. And I mean, that is really what, to me, what the arts are always about. And yeah, so yeah, that's what I like about it.
And you were also telling about further spiritual development.
Sorry?
We were talking about spiritual development.
Spiritual development.
That's right. So what else is there that you would like to explore?
Oh. Well, the thought that came to me the other day about that is, we are all lost souls. We just don't know it. That's yeah.
Thank you, Moshe. It was really my big pleasure to have you with us tonight. And yes, we are all lost souls and in a search for meaning. And I really wish you, to find what you're searching for. And it's also, for me, really big honor to have you in my life, and for you being there for me and in part of that searching that I was doing. You were my mentor. You were there for me as well. So thank you for that also.
Wow.
Now it's 7:22. We have 8 more minutes. I would like you all just to show your faces. And if there is anyone who would like to say something to Moshe or ask a question or just make a comment, now it's time to do it.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Mirjana, for organizing this. It was very, very kind of him to just spend time to allow me to talk about myself and my story. So thank you very much for that. That's really kind of you. Yeah.
Yes, Anne.
Thank you, Anne.
Sorry, I just wanted to say thank you. I put a note in the chat. I wanted to thank you deeply, Moshe, for all the training and your generosity and your wisdom and the breadth of your knowledge and thoughtfulness. It really has been very significant for me. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Moshe, I just want to say, don't ever stop teaching us. I don't think you'll ever retire, because I can't imagine it. I want to thank you for all the years of, wisdom and thoughtfulness and empathy you shared with all of us. Is just something I'll cherish forever. So I really thank you for that. And for the most beautiful dinner we had with David and yourself in the Cairns conference. That was awesome.
that was something. And the lunches we've had at Stars, sitting outside eating lunch, I remember. It's a really nice stuff. Nice stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Moshe.
Okay, it's time for us to finish and say goodbye to each other. thank you all for being here with us tonight. I know it's now at this time, almost 7:30. It's after working hours. So thanks for coming and spending this evening with us. I hope that you will come to our next, also to our next event. We still don't have a speaker, but we'll let you know soon who will be our next guest for this event. Moshe, thanks again, and hope to see you in future trainings and to see you around anyway. Yeah, see you when you come to Sydney.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Bye-bye.